stories from names you may not know, whose work you've probably seen, heard, or read without realizing. We dig into how they got here, the twists, the detours, and what's driving them now.
Today, I'm in conversation with David March.
I wanted to drive police cars or fire engines. And I remember my mum, God rest her soul, she arranged with the local police station for a traffic car to come and pull up outside our house. It was a Ford Granada, I think. So this was like, I don't know, in the 70s or whatever. But actually, thinking about it now, it was the blue lights 2-pack. I guess that's what it was. That it was the blues and twos. So it wasn't actually the idea of serving the community. I think it was just the fact that I really loved the fuzz lights. So yeah. I think that's the connection. That's what I'm telling myself.
That's funny. So you're like, I want to be part of that just because the lighting is cool.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if I'd ended up being an accountant, then maybe that wouldn't have worked. But yeah, I think that's what I wanted to do. Yeah, I was really into like Lego and books about police cars and fire engines. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to do when I was 5, but it was a long time
Is that
ago.
because you were into like the engine side of things, the incomings of how things got built, or more because of the action of it?
I think it was the action of it and probably the look of it, the styling of it. That's what I think I enjoyed looking at was the different designs. So I can remember, and I probably wasn't much more than 5, but I can remember buying this book. It was called Fire Engines in Color, and it was all these really glossy photographs of fire engines from when there was a carriage pulled by horses, right the way through to modern, and that would hold my fascination for a long time. I'd just sit there and go through it, and in fact, a few weeks ago, my niece got married, and her brother's just had a son, and he's really into fire engines. So I went home and got the Fire Engines in Color book and lent it to them and said, "Hey, he'll like this." I think the book was, I think it was £3.95. I don't know if you can buy Fire Engines in Color for £3.95 anymore. Probably not. I mean,
probably not. You'll probably buy a page.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, I had to think about that question, but then actually I thought, yeah, that was really, I think I remember what I wanted to do, and looking back, I had all of these Corgi and Dinky, models, and they were predominantly of fire engines and police cars.
And where in the UK are you at this moment? Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in a place called Chipping Ongar, which is in Essex, and it was at the end of the Central Line. So that was Ongar's claim to fame. And so you used to be able to go from Ongar to Epping, and then you'd have to get out at Epping, cross the platform, and then Epping would run into London. So that still runs, but the Ongar to Epping bit was shut down many, many years ago. So I grew up there. My mum and dad were from the East End, and they moved out like a lot of East Enders did, and they had a shop in Ongar.
Oh, what was the shop?
So my dad was a watchmaker and jeweler, and he had his own shop. So we lived above the shop, behind the shop, under the shop, in a very old building. They actually started building it in 1642. So yeah, it was an unusual place to live and to grow up and kind of be part of the shop, because our lives kind of revolved around the shop, and they worked very long hours, and it was all about the shop. And that's why actually my mum knew the police, because being a watchmaker and jewelers, it was a bit of a target. And I remember once we had these. It was the equivalent of the Sweeney Todd. Actually, were camped out above their shop because they'd got a tip off that a gang was going to come and raid us. So there were all these, police types, with their big baseball bats, and I don't know if they had firearms. We were sent to bed. My sister and I had to go to bed, but yeah, I remember that. So yeah, that's where I grew up in Ongar. So and
Did
I'm
you
not that.
were you ever attracted at the family business of like looking after watches and that kind of thing? I mean, I find them fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I do. My dad, God rest his soul, actually actively discouraged me. I can remember on several occasions he sort of said, I don't really want you to do this, because it was hard graft. And he was good at it, but he would work from 7:30 in the morning. He'd stop for lunch for an hour. He'd be back in the shop. He'd have his, evening meal with us. He'd go back in the shop, and I would say goodnight to him. He was in his workshop, repairing watches. So I don't remember actually, Tupac, having any passionate interest in it. I never really thought, I really would like to understand how to repair a watch. And I still don't know how to repair a watch. I mean, I can't even put a new battery in my own watch. So
What so how, like, when did the book come to you then? At what moment did you turn around and you went, this is an interesting field?
So I was at school, and I wasn't particularly sporty, as you can tell. And I remember it was our French teacher, and he used to take drama classes, and he also was into lighting and technical, and to get out of doing games, I would volunteer to help with the lighting. So we had a school hall with pattern 23s, pattern 123s, 743s, and all those old strand lights that many of my peers and friends remember. So that's how I got the bug, and that's where it all started. So I mean, I guess I was probably about 14, I guess, and I started helping with the lighting, and I also then got involved in local amateur dramatics, so lighting the Ongar Panto, literally.
Huh.
But yeah, I remember also, my sister and I at Christmas time we'd put on like a show, um, for our parents and grandparents, but for me the interest was the lighting. And I can remember making, I think I made a floodlight out of an old biscuit tin. So I got a biscuit tin, and I made a hole in it and poked a lamp through it, and I'd got hold of some gel samples, and that was my floodlight. So that was actually the interesting bit for me, was doing that. And I remember, at Christmas time, we'd drag them upstairs to the bedroom. They'd had a Christmas lunch and a few Leafra Milch or whatever it was they were drinking. And we would do this show, and they'd be very polite and say, "Oh, it was very nice, dear," and then it kind of grew from there, Tupac. And I think my granddad and dad thought I should be a BT engineer. They didn't really know what to do with me, so I do remember they dragged me along to a British Telecom open evening, when I was 16, and thought that would be a good future for me. But I ran a mile, I think.
I would say so.
Yeah, I mean, actually, some of my friends through the years have worked for BT, and I think back in the day in British Telecom, they didn't really do a lot of work, but yeah, but yeah, I mean, it was school, and I left school at 16, and I I don't know how this thought process came about, but I thought, well, okay, this is what I'd like to do. I'd like to be a lampy. And actually back then, and I'm talking, I guess, the mid-80s, there weren't any entertainment lighting courses. I mean, that wasn't a thing. There were stage management courses at places like RADA and Lambda, I guess. So on the stage management course, you could specialize in stage lighting for a module, I suppose. But they were 3-year. I think they were 3-year courses, and a part of that would be lighting. And then I discovered the Association of British Theatre Technicians, ABTT, which still exists. You got the ABTT show at Ali Pali now, and they had a theatre electricians course, and they'd managed to get it accredited by City and Guilds. So it was actually a City and Guilds 181, and the ABTT office was in Great Pulteney Street, which is just near Soho. And I remember going up there and doing the interview and all that, and I got a place. So yeah, I went off to Paddington College for a year. I'd get on the tube at Ongar to Paddington. I mean, how long must that have taken? It must have taken a couple of hours.
At least,
And
yeah,
it was,
90 minutes it would take probably
yeah,
right now. So yeah,
yeah,
probably a good 2
yeah,
hours.
it was, and it was an adventure because I'd never been to London, not like that. So I did a year there on the course, and you had three attachments, if you like work experience. So that was really good. So you got a local rep theatre. So I had the Queen's Theatre in Hornchurch, which was near to me. A West End theatre, I think it was the Albury Theatre. Is that by Leicester Square, I think? It's next door to the Garrick, I think. And then a rental company. And it was TBA Lighting, which was actually a guy called Tim Burnham, who was quite inventive sort of back in the day. And I think he came up with something called the Magic Lantern, and he might have got involved with ETC. I can't remember Tupac, but I had those 3 assignments, and I was still lighting amateur dramatics. But through all of this, my dad was like, well, you don't have a proper job, you're not earning any money. So I worked in the supermarket across the road, Shoppers Paradise it was called. And
What a great name.
what a great name. Yeah. But I think it was comparable, Tupac, to like Aldi and Lidl. So there was no frills. Like if you had a case of baked beans, you just pop the case on the shelf, cut the front of the box off, and that was it. You didn't take the beans out and put them individually on the shelf. So I was there, and then they said you're quite good at sort of organising people and managing and that. So I was like, oh, okay, am I? Can't I light something? Can't we have a sort of sound and light show by the checkouts? So anyway, I ended up, because it was something I was good at, and I was still doing the lighting, but I ended up working for Waitrose through my school friend Jonathan, who was working for John Lewis. And I remember he phoned me up, because that's what you did in those days, isn't it? You phoned up, and you went to the phone in the front room and hello, and he said, oh, Waitrose are opening in Buckhurst Hill, which was near me. Why don't you give it a try? So I applied, and they offered me a job as wines and non-food manager.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So I went there. I wasn't particularly good at it, but that's where I met my wife, Julie, and we've been together, married since then, 2 children, Josh and Sophie, but I upset the department managers, so I had to get out of there. And during this time, just because I was so passionate about lighting, I was aware about VARI. Oh, sorry, that just funny. I was aware of VARI, and VARI was the first really sort of commercially available moving light system, and I was just obsessed by it. You know, these lights that could pan and tilt and change color. And Genesis were really the driving force behind that, and actually they put money into VARI, as you probably know. And I wrote a letter to VARI in Cricklewood Lane, which is where they were, saying, you know, this is what I've done. Do you have any jobs? And I went along and I was interviewed by Jimmy Barnett and Eric Robinson. So Jimmy, I think, so Jimmy's name's come up just recently. I think he was at Plaza back in September, but I think back in the day, Jimmy was one of the LDs for ABBA, and Eric Robinson was this larger-than-life Australian guy that started Jan's. And they interviewed me and said, we're looking for an office assistant. You know, we want somebody to help the then general manager, Nick Dornan, to help with quotes and scheduling equipment. And it all went well. And I can remember I was back in work, back in the supermarket, and a call went out, you know, can Mr. March take a phone call? And I went and took the phone call, and it was Jimmy Barnett. And he said, hey, we'd like to offer you the job. And I couldn't believe it. And that really, that point onwards, Tupac, my whole life just changed. You know, I mean, it was an incredible time to be able to join VARI, because it was the glory days of automated lighting. So I joined them in, I think it was like 86 or something, 86, 87. In Cricklewood Lane, 112 Cricklewood Lane. So it's just off Cricklewood Broadway. Yeah, and I left Waitrose and I went and joined VARI.
What was it like to see, for the first time, a moving light up close?
Oh, it was quite surreal. It was because I'd never experienced anything like that before. I mean, the closest I'd got to any sort of automation like that was, there was actually something called a pan can back in the day, which was a mirror in a cage, and you slotted it onto the front of a light, and obviously the mirror moved, or a color wheel. But to see a moving light up close like that was really quite awe-inspiring.
I'm very jealous, actually. I'm very, very jealous of having that feeling, you know, because it's such a, I think as an industry, everyone takes them for granted. And, you know,
Yes.
I have the joke of, does it do this, does it do that, does it do this, does it do that? Well, what else does it do? Because, you know, all moving lights are basically share the same DNA, up to 90%, 95% probably. But, you know, I guess it's the closest that I can imagine being to that is when I saw a DL, maybe, you know, or when I saw,
right,
like, it's just such a, and I say I'm jealous because it was such a novelty, like you said, in the mid to the 80s, you know, and to be able to see it for the first time, it must have been like I said, honestly, I'm jealous. It's like to have that memory. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing, and I was completely sort of in awe of it all, really. And I think looking back now, I don't. It's hard to sort of take that in, but I think if you've grown up with a fixed light, you know, that's on a yoke, and you know you loosen it off and move it, and okay, and then it's fixed, you know. So this ability. And what was interesting, and you might have heard this story anyway, is that with the VARI, it was really conceived as a reprogrammable light. So the idea is, it's pointing here in red. I'm going to dim it, and then I'm going to move it and point it there in blue. But what the VARI guys hadn't really sort of realized was actually what's very, very interesting for an audience and a band is that movement where it's going from red to blue. So that, that dynamic of the beam moving, and there was this moment apparently at Verilight and Regal Row where they moved a whole bank of them and they were not dimmed, and everyone just went, whoa, like, what was that? Do that again, So this idea, of moving our beams actually sort of came about by accident. And well, the rest is history, of course. I mean, that dynamic of the lights moving. However, the theatre designers, and I remember this in probably the mid-90s, they, of course, were very much interested in the ability to have a light that could be red here, blue here, change the gobo, change the beam size. So that became for them a workhorse because it was a repositionable stage light. And they would dim it on the move. So as an audience, you weren't aware, you didn't see the beam move.
It's just, yeah, it's funny because obviously now we just take that for granted, but at the time it was not. So did you move within VeriLight then? Is that kind of how things happen? You went from being an assistant to then moving into other places?
So I always stayed on the operational, commercial side, if you were, and that was because I had a family young, which was amazing. Whereas a lot of my contemporaries that came into VeriLight, and a lot of them, Tupac, were not necessarily, electronic engineers or professors of light. I mean, they were landscape gardeners, electricians, or but because they didn't have, if you like, commitments, they went off on tour. So I went down the commercial and operational road, and I ended up being the general manager of VeriLight, and that then became VeriLight Production Services in the late 90s. So that was as a result of, well, VeriLight, the Texans, they bought VeriLight Europe, Theatre Projects, Brilliant Stages, and TP Sound from Samuelson's, because Samuelson's had the original distribution agreement for VeriLight. Have you heard of Samuelson's? They were a huge film company back in the day. I think they were the Panavision partner. And they had a very grand building on Cricklewood Broadway. But yeah, I moved through the business, and that was what was amazing about it, was the business just grew and grew and grew, because more people use VeriLight. So it diversified, not just concert touring, theatre, television, one-off spectaculars. So the inventory grew and grew from just a few hundred lights to hundreds and hundreds, thousands, and we also had a network of sub-distributors and dealers. So it was a big business, I mean,
it's just, for me, it's insane to think about it, right? Because if you think about normal corporate, you hear about these stories of people coming into the mailroom and working their way through, and then eventually becoming general managers.
Yeah.
And and we think that as a corporate kind of element. Obviously, that period in which you're talking about there's almost a professionalization and a business-like mentality being introduced to the lighting world, right? Now, you have to remember one thing. I didn't get into lights. I didn't start lighting anything until about 2004, 2005.
Oh,
So
is that
all
right?
of this that you're telling me right now is I was completely oblivious to this world.
Really?
So for me, it's
Right.
fascinating as history of
Yeah.
what was it like? What was that period
Mm.
of the professionalization of the lighting industry? I'm assuming the events and concert touring, because I must have been all together kind of moving in that. What was that like? Like, what was that first
Mm.
trade show that you went to that you said, wow?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, the Plaza trade show, off the back of the Lighting and Sound magazine. I think the magazine is 40 years old. I can remember Plaza in the mid 80s going to that. Um, and John Offord founded all of that. So my dear friend Adrian's father, he founded all of that. And there was a point in the early 90s where when Plaza was at Earl's Court, and it was the entire ground floor, you know. And yeah, to your point, I think that's when you really started to realize, wow, you know, actually this business is growing very rapidly. But it was still a time, I think, when there were naturally nowhere near as many rental companies and manufacturers as there are now, you know. Um, and in London, you know, you kind of knew who the players were, and you knew each other, and you couldn't buy Verilites, you could only rent them. So all these companies like, I don't know, Entex, Supermic, Meteorolites, you know, LSD, they would rent Verilites. It wasn't until, I guess, the mid to late 90s when High End brought out a moving light. Martin did. That's when it. That's when it became, I suppose, more of a commodity. And I look now at what's happening with LED panels, for instance, and it reminds me of what happened with automated lighting. You know, that actually it got to a point for designers where, for probably 60% of what they were doing, it was fine if it was a moving profile or a moving wash. It didn't really matter whether it was a Verilight, a high end light, or a Martin light, you know. Um, and I think that's what's happening to a point with LED panels. But I think the relationships were then super important, and I think they still are now.
Who are some designers who are now well known, obviously, but at the
Yeah,
time were just like techs that you met
yeah.
at that time?
That's a great question, Tupac. Yeah. So people like Mark Cunniff. So Mark is Ed Sheeran's designer. He works with Sir Tom Jones. So Mark was a freelance technician, and he did a lot of work with me back then. He never became a full-time Verilight technician. He was freelance. Rob Sinclair, who works in the cable department. So Rob is Queen and Adam Lambert, Peter Gabriel, Post Malone, Kylie Minogue, um, Graham Feast. I mean, lovely Graham. He's, you know, he's one of Paul Normandale's trusted operators. Andy Watson. You know, so Andy was a full-time Verilight operator, and he really wanted to be a lighting designer, Tupac. So he didn't want to be, I guess, limited to just being a Verilight operator. So he made the really brave move to go freelance. And we were like, "Whoa, what are you doing, Andy?" You know, and he said, "Well, I want to be a lighting designer." You know, and he is. I mean, he's one of the. I mean, he's a
He's
super.
amazing. He's
He's
amazing.
amazing. He's a super lovely man. You know, Radiohead. Um, so
He's
yeah, I
amazing. Yeah.
mean, so many people, Tupac.
But it's interesting, right? Because so, for example, when I was talking to Ash and Kerry
Mm,
about the UVA years, right? The golden years of UVA,
yeah, yeah,
and how that building, when you were in that building, there was an electricity of knowledge
hmm
that you didn't know it existed, right? You
yeah,
were not conscious of it, but you were
right,
aware that you were walking into a space in which you were talking to like-minded people
mm,
who
yeah,
were pushing everybody else in the way that they were thinking because of what they brought to the table. Okay. And
Yeah.
so now you look at the landscape of what's happening out there, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of people like me who had worked at UVA,
Right.
and
Yeah.
they are literally leading so many of the things that are happening in the space. But when I think about what that very light was like, and you think about all those people who were there and how
Yeah.
they actually influence
Yeah.
many of the things that
Yeah.
we started thinking about
Yes.
and looking at
Yeah.
and observing as shows,
Yeah.
and how that actually has been embedded into our brains.
Yeah.
It's really cool,
Yeah, I mean, it is really cool, and I was in awe of it all, really. And I still am. But yeah, I mean that it's very it's quite tough, I think, to put what you said in a bottle and share it with new young people that are coming through. And I think there's some great people that are trying to do that, but I had coffee with Gary Boyd a few months ago, who's very senior in PRG, and we were having this exact conversation, and he said, you guys need to write a book. He said, you need to write a book, David, because he said we're going to forget all of this. People won't know, the young people. But so I applaud you for doing the podcast. But yeah, we didn't know then, and it was really, I think it was still kind of a bit of a village industry, but you could sense it was getting bigger and bigger. But at the core of it, it was all about the designers. And Brian Croft, who was my boss, he sadly passed away. Had an incredible life. He passed away last autumn. But it was all about the relationships, and he had relationships with Patrick Woodruff, David Hersey. He knew the Rolling Stones, but that was what I think that was what drove it and bonded us all. It did still feel really like a big community, and these guys would just drop in to VARI. We were in Greenford at that point. They would just come into the demo room and just say, oh, we're trying something out. Can we just have a case of VL5s? We just want to see if this is going to work. And, the next thing you know, it's part of a design that Patrick has done for the Rolling Stones.
Yeah. So what happens at that point? So you're there. Obviously, I'm assuming that the IPO had a lot to do with your next career step, basically.
Yeah. So I think the company really changed, Tupac, a lot. And by this point there was probably 150 staff. It's tens of millions of pounds turnover, and I'd been there like 13 years. And I just felt that there was more out there. There was more going on, So there was a lot of shifting, and then in fact, what happened? So I left in '99, but then what happened was a few years after that. Actually, VARI was split up and sold. So the VLPS bit of it, which was the rental production, was bought by PRG. Excuse me. And the manufacturing, because by this point they were manufacturing to sell VARI, it was bought by a company called GenLITE, and GenLITE were a manufacturer. So VARI were still made in Dallas, but they were made by GenLITE, and then Philips bought VARI from GenLITE, and VARI is still now under that, but it's Signify, I think. So that was the point, really. I think that VARI was it changed forever. It wasn't really top of the pyramid anymore. It had sort of slid down, and of course by that point you had companies like Clay Packy, High End, Martin, SGM, not the Chauvet's Inhalations, because really at that point they, I think, were still, if you will, sort of a club and disco light. But yeah, that's when it changed, and that's when I moved on to along other paths, if you like, because I was always very curious, and I was always sort of trying to better myself. And I was still, I was young. I mean, I was early 30s at that point, so I still had energy and drive. And
Where did you go?
so I went to high-end systems. I went to high-end and Flying Pig. So and that again was another incredible place to go, because it was Northfield Road in West Ealing. So you had the Spot Co there, so people like Pete Miles and Flying Pig. So you had Beaky, Tom Thorne, and this was the point at which High End had bought Flying Pig systems. So I went in as the European operations manager, working alongside a dear friend, still a great friend, David Cattrall, who's at Roby now, and he did sales, I did commercial. So yeah, I mean that was again such an amazing melting pot in 53 Northfield Road. I mean, so they were R&Ding hog consoles and making them. So they made them. Yeah, they made them in the attic. That's right. Yeah. So there were two guys, Dave Lewing and another guy, and they were making hog consoles, in the attic at 53 Northfield Road.
Okay, so now talk to me about seeing a desk do something, because obviously that was one of those things where the desk was doing something different, right? Like that, the desk is not what we have now, and I would say within the console world, I guess that Hawk 2 was just like it.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, I think because so a few years before that, moving lights had become DMX. So, for instance, going back to VARI, the VL5, which is still, I think, a great moving light, that was DMX. So it had a 1 kilowatt PAR lamp. So you needed to plug it into a dimmer, and it was DMX. So it no longer had to be controlled through an artisan. So the hog console, as you say, suddenly could start running moving lights. So I think it opened it up to designers, didn't it? Because previously to operate and program and operate a VARI, you had to be trained by VARI. So you had to be trained by lovely Coral Cooper or Andy Voller to operate. But now, if as a designer, I could go to Hog, get trained on the Hog, and I could now have control of my whole show. So rather than being an LD and running my conventionals, alongside a VARI operator, like an Oz or an Andy Watson, Del Jones, I could now, as a lighting designer, have the moving lights also controlled with my conventional lights.
I mean, okay, I'm going to take a step back here, but tell me about, it's just, once again, these are things that I take for granted, right?
Yeah.
But when someone came to you and explained DMX, what did you think?
Oh, it blew my tiny mind. I mean, and I'm not particularly technical at all, but just as a concept of what you could do with it, just like, wow, okay, this is, just, it was bonkers, and I think that, there were designers that were really driven by the tech, but then I think also there's designers that weren't so driven by the tech, and it from a storytelling of what they can do with the show, it's suddenly seeing their eyes light up. I mean, that really was very fulfilling. I think that that ability to kind of empower creatives to really design without so many limitations.
I mean,
yeah, I mean, it was, but I watch now, Tupac, a lot of shows on YouTube. I mean, that's what I do with a lot of my sort of leisure time, and I look back, I reminisce at a lot of those shows back in the 90s, and you look at them today and you think, well, actually, the whole kind of sensation of what you're trying to do for the band and the audience hasn't really changed, has it? But the technology, of course, has.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
We have a conversation the other day about how, so as I went to art school, and as part of my BFA, I studied digital art. We're talking
okay,
digital art in the late 90s, which is
right,
very different to the tools that we have in 2025.
yeah,
But
yeah,
the essence of some of the things that we were trying to do in digital art have not changed, but
no,
the tools have, and I
yeah,
guess it's kind of similar in that way.
yeah. So did you get interested in lighting first, and how did that come about for you?
Nah, I didn't get interested into lights until like
No,
2004.
right, yeah, okay.
I
But
couldn't,
hey, I mean that's 20 years ago. That's still two
yeah,
decades, right? I mean,
yeah. You put it like that, yeah. But yeah, no, it's for me, lighting was a different path of how I
yeah,
got the lights and things like
right,
that. But
yeah.
um, so okay. So here's something really interesting, because how long were you at High End?
So I was there for about 4 years, and this was at a time when Catalyst, Richard Bleasdale, again, God rest his soul, was being distributed by High End, and then there was Radlight, which was a PC-based media server, which Steve Warren discovered, and so actually because I could see there was something here, Tupac. It was like, this is shifting. Like, it's not just iMag anymore. There's the ability that you can map digital content clips over your lighting fixtures, or on low res video. So this is terrible, isn't it? So another dear friend who's passed away, Jim Douglas. So Jim founded Projected Image, who make gobos. They still make gobos, with a guy called Steve Connolly, Rodent.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was the Sex Pistols stage manager or something. And Steve is still in the industry. They formed Projected Image, and Jim and I saw the Radlight, and we'd gone to see Paul Normandale and John Greaves up at Light Alternative, or I had anyway, and I think that they were watching a Radlight demo, and we were all just like speechless, And Jim said to me, he said, I think that this technology will have an impact on gobos. What can we do? How can we be part of that? So we started Projected Image Digital, and we became the Radlight distributor in the UK. And our first customer, and I thank her to this day, was Noreen at Entech, and they bought a Radlight, and I think it was for the Jules Holland big band, and forgive me, I can't remember the designer, but it was a very inspired designer that could see how they could use projected images, as part of that show, because Jules Holland big band, they don't move around a lot. Obviously, they sit and play. So what are you going to do to make it interesting? So yeah, Projected Image came next, and Rob Fowler worked with me there. He was my first employee. Nev Ball as well, and that Tupac is where you and I first met, actually.
It is indeed,
Isn't it? I think maybe I think we were in Chiswick at that point, maybe.
yeah, 2008. I'll get to
Right,
that in a
yeah.
second. But okay, so once again, it's like there's like a lot of firsts. Oh, this one I do remember it. Like, I remember my first time seeing Catalyst.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it blew my mind,
Mm.
to the point that I stayed. I had gone to Texas. I'd gone to Austin to do training on the Hawk 3.
Okay.
And while I was there, Kat, if you remember Kat, said,
Yeah.
she's married to Joe Cabrera.
Yeah.
she said there's a training a catalyst next week,
Ah,
and someone just dropped off. Because I asked her about it, and she was like, "Oh
right,
no, it's all full." She was like, "It's gonna be someone just dropped off. If you want to stay, I
right,
can put you in directly." And I literally made my payment at that moment, and I stayed for an extra 5 days in Austin.
right.
And but I remember what it was like to see
Mm,
this software that was like, it was the time of After Effects and things like that. So it was like
yeah,
After
right.
Effects on steroids. How was it? How was it for you? Like, what was the first time that you saw Richard show you Catalyst?
We were blown away. I think Rob and I were so at that point we were at 3 Mill Studios over near Stratford, and I think we went to have coffee with Richard because Richard loved having coffee and cake, and it blew us away. And I'd seen Pixel Mad, which was the forerunner of Catalyst, actually whilst I was still at VeriLite. So we were, because Richard had worked at VeriLite also in the very early days, and then he went and developed Catalyst. But I think Pixel Mad came first, so it was mapping content on onto fixtures, and we'd put in a wall of par cans, and he was mapping content across, and we couldn't. It was like he was a magician, Tupac. It was just I don't think we could really get our heads around it. And I think for a lot of us, it was a bit like the feelings that we'd had when we first saw Verilight. That kind of mystique. And Richard was the most uncorporate sharing guy that you could ever wish to meet. So he would just sit cross-legged on the floor, with his MacBook, just creating.
It was.
So there were no business plans. I mean, there was no strategy, no business plans. I mean, he was just helping his friends, and that was his whole MO, was just helping people like Andy Watson and Rob Sinclair and guys like that. So Nev, for instance, after PID, he went freelance. He became a catalyst operator for Rob Sinclair and a lot of those shows. Simon Pugsley as well. I think well, right up until very recent time, he was still working with Catalyst. But I think, sadly, for the time being, with Richard's passing, I think Catalyst has probably also just it's in a neutral position at the moment.
It must be, yeah.
Yeah.
I hadn't really thought about that side of things,
Mm.
but it's well, once again, it's like the sheer fact of what is able to do with Catalyst is because DMX exists. Because if not, there was no way of doing it the other way around. It's like how
Mm.
one thing triggers the next step of the
Yeah.
iterations of what's
Right.
happening.
Yes. Yeah. 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 Absolutely. I mean, I think that and it's evolving, isn't it, all the time? I suppose. And a lot of that is driven, I think, by the creatives. Although naturally, with a lot of the manufacturers now, I think it's been driven by R&D, and I suppose there's always this question, how connected are R&D with the users? And some manufacturers are very aware of that, so they have relationship managers there that are that conduit between the two.
Mm-hmm. But that brings me to the next bit, right? So
Right.
PID, right? Because obviously I would say PID was about 6 years too early. If I look at it, I think you were
Yeah.
6 years too early. I think
Wow.
that you were in the correct place, but I think it was, and in the same way that I would say the DL was
Mm.
6-7 years too early.
Yeah.
The
Mm.
What was that? The Showpix, was that the big lamp that had the 400 channels of DMX, so you can
Oh,
control and do that
shapeshifter.
the shapeshifter.
Shapeshifter?
No, it was the Showpix. The
Oh,
Showpix. Yeah.
Showpix. a Richard Bellevue creation.
Correct. Another shout out to Mr. Bellevue. But
Yeah.
like those things is, if you think about it, they were so early
Mm,
in the conceptual idea of
mm,
what needed to be done. I think I was one of the few DL operators at this point. We're
mm,
talking
yeah.
2006, 2007.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
remember moving to London, and I was talking to the high end guys, and they were like, because I was like, I just moved to London. If you guys have any contacts over here that I should know about, blah
Mm.
blah blah. And they introduced me to a few people, and one of them was you, and you were having an open day
Yeah. Yeah. You're
in,
right.
that building that you were in, and I
Yeah.
remember walking in and seeing a DL in operation by Nev Bull.
Yeah. That's absolutely goodness. Yeah. So that bit, that's the light box, and that's round the corner from Brompton. So
Yes,
so,
yes, it
so
is.
Carillon, Pharos, Brompton are in that very amazing building, on just by the Chiswick roundabout, and the light box was behind that. But yeah, I mean, I don't think we really knew what to do with a lot of that technology, and I think that's probably why it was, as you say, 6 years too early, and also it wasn't particularly touring friendly at that point either. So this was equipment that needed a lot of love and attention.
It needed love, the attention, but also it needed to have a very good concept of why
Right.
you were using it.
Yes.
I
Yes.
remember being asked, probably through you, to look at a show that was going to happen, which was Secret Cinema, that was going to
Oh,
have a few DLs
wow. Yes.
for Driscoll,
John
and
Driscoll.
I got asked to come in to
Yeah.
look after the DLs
Right.
because he wanted to do all these things with the moving image, and
Mm,
how do
mm,
we how do we use the camera, how do like all these other
right.
elements that,
Yes.
like I said, it's if the DL comes out in 2014, right, or 13 to 14, it's a completely different dynamic
Mm,
to the way that we understand video. I think that
mm,
when we look at video in 2006, 7, it was
mm.
still a novelty on a lot of the things that were happening. And
Yes.
then
Yeah.
as things move forward, little by
Mm,
little, obviously video starts becoming, YouTube becomes huge in terms of using the video, and there's a lot of other moments that kind of showcase
right.
that.
Yeah.
But the conceptual idea of having a projector within a moving light and what it
Mm,
could do, and yeah,
mm,
so it was, for me, it was amazing. I think,
yeah.
from that moment on, you and I did had a lot of fun just showcasing the technology to people.
Yeah, we did. I remember we did a similar open day at the Questors Theatre in Ealing, where Richard Mead, who is one of the directors, founders, of the whole Caroline Brompton Pharos, and we did an open day there, and I can remember Disney. They actually flew one of their Imagineers, Tom LeDuc, his name was. They flew him over because and to your point, and I'd never really thought about it like this, Tupac. We were 6 years early, so it caught the attention of Disney, and they flew Tom over just to check it out. So we were, yeah, but and then unfortunately we got we went down the architectural install path, which is a completely different animal to what you and I know, and we really got our fingers burnt. We were also distributing Element Labs. So Klaus Ernst, who's a dear friend, he was running all of that in Europe. Niels Thorgerson was behind that, and some of the guys now actually that are behind Megapixel. Anyway, we were putting things like Versatubes into the Hard Rock Cafe in Park Lane, and Versapixels, I want to say, I think into the ceiling of the G casinos. So there were some very forward-thinking architectural designers that were embracing, if you like, the the rock and roll technology and putting it into a fixed install space.
I think that the idea of thinking at that moment, because I think that the change of it is as humanity, right? We understand light because we see it everywhere. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We understood video because it was in cinemas and it was in televisions. And so we have a preconceived idea of what that is.
Yes.
And it's not until the technology starts changing where we're able to move how a pixel is understood as just another source of light rather than a piece of content.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
And how that has a development into it.
Yeah.
That we begin to see what are the possibilities of this media facades, and so
yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Sorry, I was distracted because I've got, to your point. Sorry, this isn't good for the cameraman, is it? So I should lend you this. I picked this book up. Exactly that, Media Facades. I've had it for a few years, but yeah, these designers that were working for people like Gala Casinos, who up to that point were working with very traditional conventional lighting, and suddenly they could bring this canvas in over the top of the gambling floor, and they realized that they could influence the way people were feeling through the lighting and that interaction. But dealing with building contractors was not something that any of us had any experience with, and they naturally work in a very, very different way to a live event production. And at that time as well, this was 2009, there was a recession, and we were over trading, as my accountant told me, and unfortunately we had to shut the door on it. But it's a shame because I think, to your point, if we had if I had been more aware, we could have kept it going, and we would have been in the right place as the industry embraced it more.
Yeah, it's a shame, because I think that you were at the time giving I won't call it a service, but it wasn't really a service. It was more like there was an acknowledgement of technologies and how they were developing and how they were transcending the entertainment side of things and the show, the concert side of things, and how they could be applied into what the new types of shows and the new types of entertainment could become, or a word that I hate, architainment. I absolutely hate that word.
Yes.
But that's exactly what it became,
It did. You're right. And now, of course, I suppose a lot of our dear friends and peers that were lighting designers are now, and yourself as well, a show designer, because it encapsulates it all, doesn't it? It's really brought it together.
So, and this is, it's fine if you don't answer. What was it like? What was your feeling when you had to close PID? Because obviously, it cannot be an easy decision. It cannot be
It was definitely one of the low points, I think, of my life. And unfortunately, in business as well, it involves money, and there were people that didn't get the money that they should have got, and it was horrible. It was a horrible time, and it was very sort of surreal. And that's why I absolutely take my hat off to any owner drivers of any companies now, because you make a lot of sacrifice and you're spinning a lot of plates, and typically I think a lot of people in that place, you've got young family and demands, etc. there. So yeah, it was not, I wouldn't repeat it. It did pop me off having a limited company, I have to say.
Do you think that that's something that happens to a lot of people? Like, do you think that a lot of people look at the world and go, I don't want to put myself at risk at that moment, and I might as well just stay within a business and work for a business and never make my own thing?
Yeah, I think you're right. I certainly don't regret it, just because you and I wouldn't have met, and all the other great things that happen. So I don't regret that. Yeah, and I think if you take those steps in your life, don't you? And I think particularly in our industry, there's so many examples, isn't there, of great companies that we all love and respect that started in a garage, or I mean,
Yeah,
that's where they all started. Let's
I
face
think,
it.
and a lot of, and I think a lot of this times, once again, I think it's the legacy of what you have there.
Legacy, yeah, yeah,
It's actually that is having someone like Rob Fowler, who obviously is a brilliant man. Having someone like Neff
yeah,
Bull, and
yeah, yeah, yeah,
who maybe would have never had the chance or the thought about
yeah,
becoming
yeah.
or doing that career path as a full-time job in terms of that. I think one of the ones that I always talk about is Lauren Barton, who's an
Right.
amazing, I mean, my God, as a video designer, he's fantastic. But
Yeah,
he was for the longest time he was training at he was training people at TMB,
yeah, right.
and
Yeah,
so I think that this,
yeah,
when seeing this kinds of companies, and
yeah.
it's always a shame to see them go down,
Yes,
but I
it is.
think that
Yeah, mm,
the constant that I see is the
yeah,
legacy that it leaves, and the amount of people that are brought into the
mm,
industry or have changed
yeah,
their thoughts in the industry, and what
yes,
they've gone on to achieve. The work
yeah.
that Neff does with Peter Gabriel, for example, is
Mm.
stunning.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just take my hat off to those guys, and in conjunction with Rob. Um, I should say, actually, the first show I saw with VARI was Peter Gabriel at Hammersmith Odeon, and I think I was 15, and I went with my mate Jonathan and his brother Keith and his now wife, um, and it blew my mind. It was Jonathan Smeaton,
Hmm.
whose name you don't hear so much, but he was. Oh, but I mean, I think he had like it was like 18 VL1s, not 150, which is what Genesis had at that time. But it was just how he used it. And with someone like Peter as well. I mean, the guy is such an incredible storyteller. The drama, the theatre of that. I was thinking about this yesterday, actually, that actual show, and I still remember it, and it still puts the hairs on the back of my neck up, because I remember it was Hammersmith Odeon, the house lights went down, and there was just a very low level of light on the stage, and Peter's got a song called Rhythm of the Heat, which opens with banging on big drums, and you could hear it. They were coming from the foyer, so basically Peter and his band came through from the foyer and walked down through the auditorium with the opening of Rhythm of the Heat, I think it was, and went up onto the stage. I mean, it was just, yeah,
That's amazing.
it was amazing. Yeah, yeah, just that moment. And that's really what, yeah, I mean, that still sort of sticks with me through all of it, really, is it is that show. And Sam Werrett, for instance, who I must mention, who is early 20s, he graduated from ALT, which was Backstage Academy, so that's at Production Park. He's a very young, passionate designer working for Mirad, and he's in his early 20s, and but he's so heartfelt and so passionate in how he describes the effect of lighting the show, if it's the script or the kooks I think he's just done, and I hope he won't mind me saying, but because he posted it on LinkedIn, he said at the O2 the other week, it was the second time that he's been brought to tears at a gig, because he was like, I'm at the O2, I'm running the lighting, there's 18,000 people here, and having the time of their lives for 2 hours.
Yeah, which is what we do at the end of the day.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you must
It's
feel.
I always say, I always have to feel for those people who go, it's their hard-earned money coming to see the artists and everything that we're
Yeah,
putting into,
yeah,
and they get to relax when we have to work. you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you feel now audiences are more knowing that the expectation is greater just because they've been more exposed to visuals?
I think audiences are changing in the
Mm,
way that we understand them, you know. And
okay.
obviously, I don't tour anymore. I don't really do that much music. Um, I am. I'm spending the last 3 years of my life understanding what audiences are like for all this new media.
Mm,
Obviously, I've been
yeah.
working, since 2010 on all this idea of technology and shows designs and how that has an entire effect on how
Mm,
audiences understand shows. And obviously, for the last 10 years now, almost 10
mm,
years, I've been working very heavily on technology and audience, and
yeah.
so and the development of that. So I
Okay.
think
Yeah.
that we're changing the way that we understand it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
a lot of it has to do with the way that we understand, quote unquote content.
Yeah, I mean, I remember back in the early PID days, designers would say content is king, and I suppose that's still the case. It's still relevant, isn't it?
It is. It's still relevant, but I think there's also a side of it of how. Okay, I'm going to give you the best example. Look at Glastonbury. Right? You're
Hmm.
looking at the main stage
Yeah.
on the
Okay.
show, right?
Yeah.
The the moment that someone turns on the blinders on the stage,
Mm.
right? The audience has a reaction and sees something,
Yeah.
whereas the
Yeah.
cameras are completely blown out and you don't see anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is technically something happening on stage that the people that are in the festival are seeing that the people that are in at home will
Yeah.
never see.
Yeah.
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 And
Yeah.
so why is and I think about that and I go, why is that? Well, the cameras are not properly calibrated. Someone hasn't looked at, there's
Yeah.
an entire thing. I do the show with Apple where we spend an entire day and a half looking at colors and intensity so that my blues are the same blues that we see live than we
Oh
see on
wow.
camera.
Good.
The
Good.
reds, I have people go, how is it I can see your reds, your oranges, your magentas, your blues, your cyans, your baby blues, your deep blues? You can see the entire gamma of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that doesn't happen very often.
No, it doesn't. You're right. Yeah. Absolutely. And that's really crucial. Yeah, I know, particularly perhaps in more corporate shows, because then if you're working with a logo, and I suppose an Apple show, for instance, you're working with a lot of their um, their identity, so the colours have got to be exactly spot on.
It is. And so, I think that in that sense, that's for me where audiences are
Mm,
changing, I guess is
yeah,
the best way, is in the easiest way of putting it and
yes,
understanding.
yeah.
So,
Mm.
oh yeah, go for it. Go for it.
LED bands that Paul Normandale did with Coldplay. I mean, I can remember Paul talking about that years ago. He was like the band. That they want the audience, they want to bring the audience in. So they were brainstorming it, and Paul said, "What's the first thing an audience do when they hear the opening bars of a song they love? They go like this. They put their arms up. So let's put an LED band on here, and yeah, I mean
Yeah.
I think Coldplay bought the company, and
Yeah.
it's even now an important, very important feature of their show.
Shout out to Pixmob. I mean, those guys did,
Well, absolutely, yeah.
I was there at Coachella 2011 on the early
Oh wow,
prototype of what eventually became
really?
the wristband. Yeah.
Right, okay.
We spend a lot of nights together looking at stages crying. It's the only way I can put it.
Well, tears of joy and despair.
No, despair, pure
Despair.
despair. Yeah, 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 pure despair. I mean, it's one of those things when you're making something new and the guy next to you are doing also something new, and you're all looking at it going, "How in the world are we going to pull this off?"
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean that. Oh,
Yeah,
you must have had your fair share of those moments sitting front of house. Yeah.
and not only in front of house in different places, but it is what we do.
Mm.
So okay, so you have the disappointment of PID, because I guess is the only way of putting it.
Yeah, yeah.
How do you get yourself back up, and what's your
Mm.
next move?
Well, I went back to my first love, if you like, which was VARI. So I was really very fortunate. I joined PRG Distribution to run their VARI distribution, because when, as we talked earlier, the whole VARI going to PRG Genlite, PRG were the European distributor for VARI. So I was very lucky. I went to work with Martin Lockett, Richard Williams, Matt Hallard. Phil Norfolk was running PRG Distribution, so he'd left, and I came in and took over.
That's
So
once again another bunch of all stars of a completely different side of the business.
yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that's everything we say about the show and how that makes us feel. It's absolutely those people. As you reminisce and you talk about them, and you you remember the good times, the bad times, and yeah. So that's what I went and did. But what happened there was that Philips, who owned the VARI distribution, they owned VARI. So Philips owned VARI. PRG was selling it under agreement, and Philips bought the agreement off PRG. So we were 2P'd over to Philips, and Matt Hallard, Ron Carrington, Riku, God rest his soul, Thierry Dupont. I mean, all these wonderful people. We were 2P'd over to Philips, and again, I remember this moment, Tupac, kind of the sort of extremes of our industry. We were sitting in the Philips headquarters in their meeting room after the 2P happened, and in their showroom they had electric toothbrushes, toasters, and we were like, oh my God, like what has happened, because it was like, so I think this is kind of what's crazy, isn't it, about our industry, is here is a company that was founded by some noise boys at Showco that got into lighting. They invented the VARI light. Genesis, arguably one of the UK's most successful prog rock bands, put money into it, and now it's owned by a company that make electric toothbrushes.
Well, at least you knew you were going to have good electrodomestics.
Well, yeah. Hey, no, I mean, that was the good thing. Tupac is like you got a Philips discount, so we were like, oh, this is really good. We can order an electric toothbrush and you get a discount. So again, George Masick, Bob Shackrell, Julie Smith, all these wonderful people, we were all there. And unfortunately, over a period of time, it just wasn't sinking, the whole Philips VARI thing. They also bought, I want to say, maybe 088. So I think Grant Bale-Smith, who is actually, with Signify VARI still, he was part of that. But we went on our way along other paths, because the whole Philips thing really just, it was just way too corporate there was a lot of sex appeal, I mean, that was the thing. And I remember in that Philips meeting, actually what the Philips people were really interested in was, so can you get us tickets for shows? And we were like, well, yeah, probably, but you're not going to the show and meeting the lighting designer, because with all due respect, you know nothing about our industry. I'm sure you could advise them on electric toothbrushes and toaster, but
Do you think that there's an element of that sexiness that prompted all the, Samsung buying Martin, at some point high end
Mm.
being bought by Barco.
Yeah.
Like this crossovers of things where they think they're gonna get. So the way that I see it on my side is all these companies are thinking they're gonna get an insight into something that they can use to
Mm.
better their products. And
Right.
there's never like the other side in which what are you doing right now that can actually better
Mm.
our side of the industry.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, and I think what I always observed is that those corporates always think they always thought they knew better than the people that were running the business. So rather than truly listening and empowering, not in all examples, but in a lot of them, they thought they knew better and they just would mess it up. And I think the people that knew better, who were the founders and owners, they would just get sucked into this world of, P&L and EBITDA and not being able to sort of act as they wanted to previously. If you want to buy a new pencil, you've got to fill in 4 forms, and
Because that must be a shock to the system for you guys to suddenly you have the freedom to do all these things. And
well, yeah, and again, I think that we didn't have that experience, and I see and hear that a lot now. Is a lot of people that have created these companies were sound engineers or lighting technicians. They weren't business people, and I think if your business is bought by a professional business person who works for Philips, that you've got to respect their knowledge, but they don't have you don't have that experience and knowledge. So I think you end up it sort of gets lost in translation, and actually for VeriLite, for instance, and I think I can say this because it was a long time ago, when VeriLite decided that they wanted to go public, their target share price when they launched, I think, was $12, and actually it launched at under $1 because the reality of actually, when it came to the point of going public and the investors looked at it, then that was what they were prepared to buy into. So that sex appeal, if you like, actually was not really putting real value on the balance sheet. It was a sexy thing to do, but as you and I know, if you've got a bunch of lights out on a tour, there's a lot of variables, isn't there? Like you've got to support it, and suddenly the truck's late, you've got to throw more crew at it, and so suddenly you've got all these variables that you can't control, and if you're a grown up big business, you don't like that, because you don't like variables and the inability, I think, for the company you've invested in to not be able to accurately forecast.
Yeah, and also because for every lamp that you buy, you need to buy 3.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, unfortunately, there are those variables, and I think, I mean, how many times do we hear, you're having a coffee with a colleague who works for, a grown-up rental company or manufacturing. They're like, oh, we're not going to hit budget. We're not hitting our targets. This quarter's down. And you look at it and you go, well, yeah, but actually that's where the actual business is right now. That's the reality of where we're at, and I think the skill is really understanding that and sort of managing that track.
Mm-hmm. So then,
Difficult,
very, very difficult. So then you made a decision at some point, and then you moved truly into the LED world, into imagery.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
was that jump?
It was quite challenging, I think, because again, technically, it moved on. It's moved on a lot. So and I hadn't perhaps kept pace with that so much. So I was always very reliant on the technical people around me, So I've got I've got the relationships with those designers and with that network, but that kind of technical knowledge, I think that's where it's really moved on a lot. So that was definitely a challenge.
I have a word that I use, which is the LED war.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
it's like what makes a good product nowadays, and we're literally, as you said before, I have a joke, which is this, can you LITE do this, can you LITE do that, can you LITE do that, can you LITE do that, and
well,
suddenly you're turning around to LED and you're going, well, can you LED do this, can you LED do that,
yeah, yeah.
like what is the difference, what makes you different to the
Hmm.
product that is being sold by the booth that is next door, or by the other
Well,
guy who's calling me right now?
yeah. Have you been to ISE in Barcelona? You've seen it, right? I mean, just how many LED companies? I think certainly the engineering quality, the design, the ability that to have a panel that is robust and is going to stand up to touring, that you can still be renting in 5+ years, but of course that comes at a price, and I think, like you say, it is an LED war, and I think I sort of often, talk about, there's a pyramid, you've got those companies at the top, and then in the middle, it's really very, very competitive, and I think naturally it's return on investment, and how much is if you're a rental company, how much is your customer going to be prepared to pay for that LED panel? And a lot of that, I think, will depend on what their application is in terms of what they're trying to do with it. What's the demands being placed, I suppose, creatively and physically on that panel, and do they need a Rolls Royce, or can they have a Ford Mondeo? I mean, that's oversimplifying it, but I think that and I think this is what happened with automated lighting as well. Tupac is that it became a more of a commodity position, and for a lot of design, there is no such thing perhaps as a bad automated light or a bad LED panel. I mean, unless you're at the bottom of that pyramid.
Yeah, I think that right now, if you were to look at where the industries are, obviously the desks are still a little bit different, and although
Yeah,
every single desk can program whatever you want it to do, some of them are different depending on who you have and blah 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 blah. But there's still a differentiator in there that is palpable, right? And I would say even within media servers, you have the same
yeah,
kind of thing still. Whereas you'll go into like cameras, maybe not as much, or
right,
like you said, lighting and video panels and even projectors, up to a point they've been homogenized to
mm,
be correct. So
mm,
then flipping that on this head, right,
mm.
because you've been basically on both sides of it,
Both
like
sides. Yeah,
what makes a good product to distribute, what makes a good product to rent, and at which moment do you say, no, this is not correct, to either side of it, to your
mm,
R&D team to say, yeah, we're ready to distribute, or to your rental team to say, right, let's go and buy a
mm,
bunch of those things? Because that's the thing, isn't it? Your commitment in rental is you're not
yeah.
buying one,
No.
you're buying 50.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that um, it needs. It's got to be roadworthy. I think you really need something that's got minimum bench time. Minimum turnaround. Because if you're a rental company, you want to turn that around and get it back out the door again. So I think that's a factor. I think being able to satisfy probably say 80% of what a designer and a production need out of that product is important. But I think also now, Tupac, of course, there's other factors as well, such as like payment terms, discount, credit lines. So if you're a rental production company, that is also, a factor of, okay, well, are we going to buy from that company or not? And are we going to buy more of their stuff because we've got a strong relationship with them? We've got a strong trading relationship, so we get better terms. So I think it's much more difficult now to satisfy all of those pots. And if you're, whether you're financing it yourself or whether you're owned by a VC and they're putting the money in, you can't ignore those controls around payment terms, for instance, and cash. So I think it's very difficult. It's very difficult balancing all of that, and then in amongst all that, when you take delivery of your product, being able to rent it out consistently, and have the confidence that when it comes back off a tour, you can check it, you can re-prep it, and it can go back out again, and it's not going to sit on the broken shelf for a month.
It's there's the economics of touring and shows that, for example, we used to laugh. I think between myself, Nick, and Manolo in the 2010s, when we would do Fashion Week.
Yeah.
I think that between the 3 or 4 designers, we would hire something along the lines of 3,000 source force for a week.
For a week. Yeah.
By the time you put it all the shows. Right. And I remember someone was there was a theater production that was about to go in around the same period as Fashion Week. And I remember telling the designer, you want to block those source fours, mate? And he was like, why? Like, because there's 4 of us that take a lot of them.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. And of course, you only need 3,000 source fours maybe for a week, and so you get those peaks and troughs, of course, don't you?
Yeah. It was, it's ridiculous in that sense. So, I know you had a health scare.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And first of all, I'm glad to hear that you're well and that everything is good.
Thanks to
So what? Because obviously you're not going to stop. As I always tell people, this is a job that no one stops. So what is it that you're doing now? What are you up to?
So what I'm doing is what is called sort of fractional work. So it's basically freelancing, trying to really understand how I can tap in to my experience and knowledge that we've been talking about, and offer that to, I think, particularly the younger companies that don't have that experience and are not in a position, say, to bring that experience in full time, but it would benefit them to, say, have a bit of that experience for a day, or so that's what I'm trying to do. It's called BuddyMarch, after my dog Buddy, who's here. That was my working title, and then I spoke to some industry friends, and they said you should call it that, because that's who you are. It needs to be personal. It's not a corporate thing. So so that's what I'm doing, Tupac, and I'm helping 3 companies at the moment. And conversations going on, and it's the joining of the dots which I find really thrilling. And because it's such a small business, isn't it, that you're never more than one person away from knowing somebody that company knows, or and so that's what I'm really enjoying, and I think that's the value. And I look back on all that stuff that I did, Tupac, and I'm thankful that I had the opportunity to do all of those things and wear all those hats, because it makes me quite unique in that sense, that I know a lot of people, whereas I think, well, if I just worked for, one company, and, that would have been great, but you're maybe not so exposed then. And also, as you said, sitting both sides of the table as well. So having worked for manufacturers and rental companies. So that's what I'm doing, and I feel that there seems to be an appetite for it. You know, it's been very well received, which is amazing. And I think, and interestingly, so Richard Williams, for instance, who I mentioned earlier, he was the MD at PRG UK. He was with them for 25 years, and Richard left PRG earlier this year, and Richard's now also offering fractional help, but looking more at, you know, finance and admin and systems. So yeah, I mean, I suppose it's not a new thing, but perhaps in this current climate where economic uncertainty is the challenge, it's so yeah, that's what I'm doing. No more shiny job, as I've said, but I've loved every shiny job I've had, and you know, but it still gives me a thrill to be involved in it all. And I don't play golf, so I helped out an amateur dramatic production earlier in the year locally. So I went and hung lights, and it nearly killed me, Tupac. I mean, I was absolutely just fit for nothing the next day. But I just thought, well, it's kind of how it started for me. So I went back. These lovely guys, VSL Productions, I just name check them. They did all the lighting and sound for it. It was Beauty and the Beast at my local hall.
Nice, full circle.
Yeah, I mean it is. Yeah, and yeah, I got light. I mean, we all have. You know, I got lights in the shed. You know, mirror ball and a laser, and like if we have a party, for me, that's an excuse to, you know, to light it, and that. Yes, I still love doing that. You know.
Thanks to David for the conversation. If you'd like to dive deeper, head to our Substack, glyph-podcast, for show notes, links, and extras. You can also follow us on Instagram and TikTok at glyph-podcasts. If you'd like to see a video of this conversation, head over to our YouTube channel. My name is Tupac Martyr. See you next time.